Okay, let's go ahead and get started today. Don't forget that the exam is coming up on Thursday. I will actually be out of town on Thursday, so I will set up an online exam for you to take through Blackboard, and I'll give you the freedom of you take it in time during that day. You don't have to take it during the class time. That way, you don't have to worry about coming here if you don't have any other classes, and so that will be available on Blackboard. I'll send out an email letting you know where to look for it and how to find it. And so we'll just go that route for this exam. We're finishing up talking about the early Middle Ages today, and talking predominantly about changes that occurred related to Christian practice and some of the things that Christians began to do or changes that they undertook related to practice. But before we get to that, I wanted to finish up with some things related to the Christological controversy that we talked about before.
Sorry, before. The chapter summary review today or Friday?
They're due today.
Okay. So that's not before.
Yeah. Yeah, the chapter summaries are due today.
Okay.
We were talking last Thursday about the various Christological controversies that took place in the early Middle Ages as Christians attempted to specifically lay out how Jesus was both human and divine. An area, of course, that Scripture doesn't really talk too much about, but that Christians felt were a need. So we talked about the different controversies as various people tried to take various positions on this. Predominantly, of course, this was a Eastern issue, and even after the Council of Chalcedon, which is supposed to end all of this, right, bring everybody together, there are essentially still three different groups in the East. There are those that follow the view of the Council of Chalcedon, that essentially had taken pretty much the view that was prominent in the West, Jesus being two natures but one person. Others, however, did not support the Council's definition of faith, I should say, and so there were the Monophysites who followed Cyril of Alexandria, who to some extent followed the views of Eutychus, that there was one nature and one person. So the views of Apollinaris is what I meant to say. And so Cyril of Alexandria and the views of Apollinaris. And then there was also the Nestorians, who began to refer to themselves as the Church of the East. They tended to be more of the two persons, two natures view that was somewhat shaped by Eutychus, but also was shaped by Nestorians. Now, emperors, of course, were involved in all of this, and they also were focused on trying to be in unity. So they tried to mediate with those who supported Chalcedon and those who supported the Monophysite view, but that didn't really go very far. Additionally, there was a lot of dissatisfaction, even among those that supported the definition of faith, because the West had been so involved in shaping it. And so because the Roman Catholic Church had been involved, that had really affected them, upset them. And fortunately for the emperors, they could largely ignore what Leo had said because the West was kind of going in a different direction. And so that wasn't as big of an impact as the Eastern Church. And just like what we saw with the Nicene-Arian controversy, as emperors kind of went back and forth depending on the emperor, the same kind of thing happens with Chalcedon as people move back and forth over the next several decades. Ferguson actually gets into much more detail over this issue that we won't really get involved in. However, we're still not done. As we move into the 7th century, there was a variety of other controversies that came up with us. So the Emperor Heraclius tries to unite the Christians under his rule, and these Christian controversies. He wants to hold on to Chalcedon because Chalcedon had reaffirmed the authority of Constantinople. So if you kind of overturn that, then there is the danger that once again people will be debating whether or what authority Constantinople has. But largely, he holds on to this two natures, one person doctrine. Although his oneness of Jesus isn't tied to the Western view of one person. The Patriarch of Constantinople tries to sell this by saying Jesus had two natures and one energy is the term he uses. Well, what does that mean? Right? And so there's disagreement about that. All of this trying to then find a compromise. Pope Honorius, who is the Pope at the time in Rome, encourages don't use the term energy, but use the term will. Two persons, one will. Well, it's not really clear what he means, but it's used. Now, possibly it meant in a moral sense that Jesus had one will when it came to do and when it came to living morally. However, you have this development of a group known as the monothelites, who argue Jesus had two natures, but one will, the divine will. Now, here too is the question. Does it matter if Jesus had a divine will or a human will or two wills? Well, the question is related to that larger question of how fully human does Jesus have to be in order for him to save humanity. The monothelite controversy, however, which developed during the 600s and the 7th century, eventually was condemned. Eventually, the emperors have decided enough's enough. And they passed a variety of legislation to prevent people from publicly discussing these kinds of issues because it was causing so much controversy, which also strained the relationship between Rome and Constantinople. Officially, in the Third Council of Constantinople, which is the Sixth Ecumenical Council, the affirmation is Jesus had two wills. He had a godly will and a human will. They work together, but they are not fused. So largely, like we said before, these controversies appear to be just wrangling about works. And to some extent, I think that's correct. But on the other hand, it was Christians who had been shaped by the philosophical speculation of Greece to try and be very concise and comprehensive when it came to describing these kinds of things. What is a person? What does it mean to say Jesus is God and human? And so that's kind of a holdover from some of that culture. Largely after this time, there isn't as much of a discussion about these issues as we move into the later Middle Ages. They're still around every so often, but not to the major extent of what we're seeing here. Predominantly because, as we go forward into the later Middle Ages, the Islamic concern becomes bigger of how Muslims are encroaching on the Byzantine Empire. Let's move on then to practice and talk about some of the changes that were taking place in practice. One of the big changes that we'll start off with is some of the changes that were occurring with monasticism. Monasticism had kind of reached its peak in the East around 400. In the West, it still wasn't a major facet of Christianity. There were some individuals in the West who practiced monasticism, but not anywhere near like it was in the East. But in the East, you also began to see, or you continue to see, a lot of extremes. People like the Boscoi, who grazed like cattle. People like the Dendrites, who lived in trees. Again, all of this is meant to somehow make them more holy. Monks would walk around wearing chains. And then there is the individual we've mentioned before briefly, Simeon Stylites. He sat on top of a pillar that he built, that he would raise over several years, eventually to the height of 60 feet, and stayed on top of that pillar for more than 30 years. Supposedly, he would stand motionless all night. He would touch his forehead with his feet, although I have no idea what that would prove, except that you have really good balance. I don't know how that makes you closer to God. And he would pull up with a rope food and water that some individuals would give to him. Eventually, though, communal monasteries became more of the norm than these anchorite types of monks. And that helped ease these extremes as monks gathered together. One of the challenges in the East is that often the monastic communities would side with heretics, which meant that a lot of other church leaders were very suspicious of monks. But when Nestorius promoted his views that Mary should be called Christ-bearer instead of God-bearer, that tended to be the one place where the monks tended to break with heretics. They were deeply devoted to Mary, and so often sided with the more Orthodox church. In the West, monasticism developed from several different places. Usually, it appears to have been done because of people who were fleeing from the Germanic tribes. Largely, though, the West was slower to catch on than the East. There had been some influence from the writings of Jerome, writings about a man named Anthony, who was a popular monk in the East. And then also the story and life of a man named Martin of Tours. He was born in the middle of the 300s in what is now Hungary. His father was a pagan soldier, and because of that, Martin had grown up in various parts of the empire. But while a young man, he decides to become a Christian, and actually, adds his list to the list of the catechumens. But his parents are very opposed to this decision. So much so that his father actually forces enlistment in the army on Martin so that they can get him away from Christians. He will serve under Julian the Apostate, for several years. And while serving, he meets a beggar, according to the legend, he meets a beggar who is shivering from the cold, has very little clothing, he's begging for money, but Martin has no money to give him. And so he cuts his cape in half and gives part of it to the beggar. Usually this is an example of how he's depicted. And so statues depict him cutting his cape in half or other things like that. He will later have a dream where Jesus will appear to him wrapped in this half of a cape, suggesting to Martin that this was Jesus who he encountered as a beggar. And Jesus says to him in this dream the words from Matthew 25, "Inasmuch as you did this unto the least of these, you did it unto me." As a sidelight, this is where you get the origins of the word chapel, referring to a piece of a cape or capella. Also like a cappella, as done in church. And so coming from Martin of Tours, giving part of his cape to this beggar. Well, shortly after this dream, Martin is finally baptized. He still has to serve in the army for a few more years before he leaves. Later, he will decide to follow the monastic life and gets a reputation of being very holy. Eventually elected the bishop of the city of Tours. But even as bishop, lives a very simple monastic life. He's becoming famous because of some of these stories about his life, and he still tries to keep the simplicity. So instead of living in the bishop's house, he will kind of move away from town and try to guide people from there. After his death, his example convinces people that this is what the office of bishop should be. I should say convinces some people that this is what the office of bishop should be. It should be simple. It should be concerned about charity. And so the impact of the monastic life on church leadership is begun in the West through Martin of Tours.